Hello and welcome to Lit Illuminated. I am Rebecca Beardsall and I'm thrilled to have you here with me today. This is a space for us to talk about the way that books connect us, that it is a space to dive into narratives, the way stories unfold, and how we can see ourselves and the world in those spaces, and how it's not just about the stories themselves, but it's also about the ways that we are connected. So thank you for joining me today on today's podcast. So this is a little bit of Rebecca's musings, and I am talking about a book, but I'm also kind of going out onto other areas. But I taught the workshop last weekend on Deborah Miranda's Bad Indians, a tribal memoir. And it's one of my favorite books. I have taught it many times, and I think every time there's this new way of me seeing things. And even, what I'm going to talk about today is something I've talked about in a bunch of the classes that I've taught on this book. But for some reason, it really struck me this time and it really resonated with me. So I love Miranda's memoir for the way that she pushes against the boundaries of what is narrative, what is prose, and that she uses multiple techniques. She uses hermit crabs, she uses collage, she uses poetry, she uses, translation or transcription of audio. So the heart of it starts off with the fourth grade mission project, and she moves into that space, and that I think the conversation that I had in the workshop this weekend was really about the methodology, but I talked about how she uses this concept of a story bridge. And so I'm just going to read the first quote on that. There's a couple in the text throughout about this idea of a bridge. But at the end of the introduction, she says, "My ancestors collectively are the story bridge that allows me to be here. I am honored to be one of the bridges back to them, to their words and experiences." And so in this way, Miranda's basically telling us that, she's a bridge back to them, and that in this space, we're going to hear about them and their stories. And that's the one thing I really love about this too, is that the way she allows their stories to unfold and to, really be their own in that space, and the layering that she also, creates through time in the book. And so I'm teaching the workshop, I'm talking about the bridge. I'm like, yeah, this is great. We start talking about some other things, the layering of, her family in there. And I'm like, once again, she's using the bridge. And later on, she says, sometimes our bodies are the bridges over which our descendants cross, spanning unimaginable landscapes of loss. So she continues throughout to acknowledge this space of bridge and storytelling and why that's important. And I'm loving this, right? This idea of how we are connected to our histories, how those histories connect to our future. And in this way, she's seeing herself as this story bridge to bring this story to life in this book, which again, fabulous, amazing. Really that, she's using Bad Indians as a way to showcase how she is that bridge. Anyway, so when I was teaching it, it came to me that this idea of the bridge is also layered and connected to the spiral of time. So I've talked about this before. It's also in my memoir, actually both my memoirs, The Unfurling Frond and The Spiral of Time. And I learned about the spiral of time when I was studying Māori literature and literature of Aotearoa, New Zealand. And this is a methodology of how they think about time, that it is a spiral, that we are connected to the past, present, and future in a spiral, and that you can go up and down that spiral, and that the past is ahead of you, the future is behind you, but in a spiral space that it can collapse down and you can be in that space simultaneously. And so one of the ways that in Māori artwork and literature and and carvings, they use a kuru. And the kuru is like this spiral motif that, is often found in the ko-fi-fi patterns. And it also in some way represents a fern frond. And so when I was like thinking about this idea of Storybridge and the way that it connects us to the past and the present and the future, and how somehow we are in that space, we become the bridge. Like our bodies, our hands as we write, become that bridge to bring the past into the present or the future into the present, that we physically become that bridge. And thinking about the fern frond, I was, meditating about this and just writing about it and thinking about, how Miranda talks about being a story bridge. And then I was like, whoa, the fern frond. So I have a little visual here to help us in the conversation. So fern frond, right? So in this, we have like the main, and I am not getting the terminology right, but say this is the main like stem. I don't know. And then each one of these branches in are their own little spiral. So like a big spiral with a whole bunch of little spirals attached to it. And then as it unfurls, right, we see it's connected with these leaves, right? And in some way, you could say we are one of these, right? In the way that our family is, or we are, and that when it unfurls, these become the lives that are attached to this one, right? And then if you think of that as an individual or a family, that then this larger one connects you to the next one, right? And then the next one. And, you could even say that this could be, whatever your belief system is, like this main one that takes you down into the root, into the ground. Could be source, God, whatever you might put in there, the universe, light, could do that, right? Could be that whole big one. Or you also think about, normally this isn't just like one single one, right? It comes down and there's even multiple ferns connected to the root, right? It's just so connected. And this idea of these big stems, like the big stem that takes you to all the little leaves that are also their own stem, are the body bridges. Like these are the bridges. And this is how we not only, have the ability to tell our story, but the story of all that are connected to us in the smaller leaf space. And we become that story bridge. But that the larger story bridge connects us to other people's story bridges. And, this is something that I've been talking about in a bunch of my podcasts and even things that I've been putting on social media. This idea that as a writer, and even as a reader, but as a writer, you are not writing alone. You are joining a collective that is already out there, that is already in this space. And they could be people that you agree with or don't agree with, or their stories are totally different to the way you would tell the story, whatever. You are still entering into the space of the written word. And this is how I often talk about the need to read like a writer, in the sense that you can move into those story bridges as an observer, as someone taking in the story, right? As the reader. But you can also enter that story bridge as a writer. And in that way, researching, investigating, trying to learn how the author told the story as it is. So in a way, the author is the story bridge, and they are physically writing and building their story as part of the fern frond, and they're unfurling that story in front of us. And we are the observer. We're walking in the woods and we see the fern and we look at the fern and we see how it's connected and how this story unfolds, and how the beauty of the sunlight on the fern frond, or the way that the wind, moves the frond. And this is the way that we observe and study and absorb the story bridge that's in front of us. That isn't our story bridge, but it's somebody else's. And so by reading it, it becomes part of our story in some way or other, right? Like I think about the way that Bad Indians by Deborah Miranda really changed me as a writer in some way, showing that you can take on different forms. You can break the rules a little. You can make up your own rules if you want. And you can allow the story to tell itself how it wants, right? So she uses imagery in this book. I use imagery in my books. And I think a lot of that is because I feel like the images can tell their own story. You don't need me. I can tell you what the images mean to me, or I can talk about what is related, like what's related to me in that image. But really, when the reader looks at the image themselves, they're taking in how they're going to take it in, right? And so no matter what my intention is and how I'm using those images to tell my story, someone is going to read that with their own background, their own history, their own past, their own future, right? This way that they are stepping into my space with all of their space, with all their ancestors behind them, with all their history behind them, well, actually in front of them. And so again, this concept that as writers, we take people on this journey of the spiral of time. And as a reader moving into that space, you become part of other people's stories as you absorb and read those stories. And those things become now part of your memory, part of your own narrative about how you're walking in the world in some way. Like I think about how often people quote books or quote movies or quote, right? Like these narratives become part of our narratives. And even if they don't become your story, like as your physical story, there is a layering there. And so again, I have taught this book many times, and I've talked about the story bridge, and I've talked about how Miranda does a wonderful job bridging these spaces and just kind of moving us through time. And it just clicked, right? When I thought about this image of a fern frond and the idea that these lines are the bridges, we become the bridges and span out, but that how we're all connected. And that this is why books are important, because not only do they help us as writers to share our story, whether it's a story about ourselves and like a memoir, or it's a story about a historical event as if it's nonfiction, or it's a story that's been living inside us in fiction. Those stories are us, and we bring them out into the world to bridge a gap, to add to the larger collective of story, of narrative. And when readers come into that space, whether they're writers or not, they also join in to this space, and we become a collective, and we learn about ourselves and gain insights about ourselves and the world through these spaces. We are story bridges for ourselves and for each other, and through it all, we are all connected. These are the thoughts that I am having. If you haven't read Deborah Miranda's Bad Indians, I highly recommend it. It's a beautiful memoir. It's difficult. There's really hard things in there. But the way that she tells the story is mesmerizing. Thanks for listening to me today. I wish you all the best.